Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for giving up a kind of hot and muggy evening to spend it here at Science Gallery London with us. So I'm Jen, I'm head of programming at Science Gallery London, and I'm just essentially welcoming you to this space before handing over to Jen and Sam from London Data Week. So I hope many of you have had the time to explore our exhibition, which just launched last week, AI, Who's Looking After Me? I'd love to know what you thought about it, and I hope some of the exhibits that you will have encountered are shaping how you're thinking about some of these questions on the cards. So before I hand over to Jen and Sam, I'll just explain a little bit about what Science Gallery is. So we're a space to grow new ideas across art, science, and health. And what we would love for everyone coming through the doors to experience is a new provocation or a new way of looking at a subject such as AI, which is impacting all areas of our lives today. So really looking forward to the discussion with you tonight. Just to say, if there is a fire alarm, we haven't planned it, so that means we will need to leave the building. So the way out from this space is up via this staircase behind me and through the door in the corner. So please follow me or Carol at the back, and we will get you out safely. So without further ado, please can I welcome Jen and Sam from London Data Week.
Thank you so much, Jen. Hi everyone, my name's Sam Nutt. I'm the data ethicist at the London Office of Technology and Innovation. We're the local government innovation unit that sits across London local government.
Hi everyone, I'm the other Jen Ding. I'm a researcher at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI.
And we're basically the co-founders of London Data Week, of which this is the first event of the first ever London Data Week. So thank you so much for you guys for coming. Thank you. I think firstly, we just want to give a really big thank you to the Science Gallery team here. Jen and your team have been fantastic, amazing throughout. So thank you so much. Before we kick off, we're not going to speak very long, but we're just going to give a bit of background about London Data Week, how it came about. Basically, Jen and I here, we've been thinking about this for about a year or so now. And it kind of came out of us thinking, what would it be like if we did the opposite of a tech conference? By that, we mean, what happens if we have open conversations, public conversations, where we can imagine the future about data and AI, with the public part of that process. This is kind of our version of what we think that might look like. We've created it, so London Data Week actually kicks off next week, running from the 3rd to the 9th of July. It's an event being delivered by lots of different partners doing their own things all across London. So like the Science Gallery, like other amazing organizations like the Open Data Institute, the Royal Statistical Society. There's so many people, there's KCL, there's so many people I couldn't list them all. So thank you to everyone who's been involved. We've got some fantastic things. So if you are interested, please do go on our website, londondataweek.org. You can find other tickets to other events there. But I'll pass over to Jen for a bit more about tonight.
Thanks, Sam. So as Sam mentioned, part of our goal is to create spaces for new kinds of conversations about data and AI, and we're starting with that today. Tonight, we're really excited to kick off with this event. Thank you all for coming, about what building better AI in the open could look like. How can public participation lead to better outcomes in how AI is produced and increasingly deployed in our everyday lives around the world? So with that, I will introduce our speakers for tonight. And a bit of housekeeping. So after we finish here, we'll then launch into a presentation from Margaret Mitchell, and then a panel discussion with all the speakers and Q&A. And as a heads up, I think you might have seen, but this session will be live streamed and recorded. So to get started with our intros, Margaret Mitchell is the Chief Ethics Scientist at HuggingFace, leading work in machine learning data governance, AI evaluation, and AI ethics. Previously, she worked as a research scientist at Microsoft and Google AI and co-led Google's ethical AI group. She has been named one of Time's most influential people of 2023. Lara Gross is an AI accountability practices researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute, focused on pressing topics like exploring the role of public participation in commercial AI labs and algorithmic impact assessments. And Caroline Sinders, our wonderful facilitator for tonight, is a machine learning design researcher, artist, and online harassment expert whose work includes the feminist dataset and how to explain a hurricane to an algorithm. And finally, we will also have another speaker who's joining us online, and that is Irini Papadimitriou, who is the creative director. Oh, there she is. Hi, Irini. She is the creative director of FutureEverything and the curator of the AI Who's Looking After Me exhibit that some of you might have explored already. She's also a co-founder of Maker Assembly and a co-curator of the Arts and Culture Experience at Mozilla Festival. So thank you all for joining us, and now over to Margaret for our presentation.
Hello, everyone can hear me okay and nice. All right, and I haven't even tried this yet, so hopefully the slides and the clicker work. Right, so thank you all for coming. I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about a few projects and a few sort of values at play in open science and open source work. So some topics I'm just going to very briefly cover. We could maybe talk more in the Q&A or some food for thought, is around open source and closed source. A project called Big Science and the work we did on data governance. A project called The Stack, which is an open approach to automatic coding and helping people with code, and a strategy called the release gradient. Right. So open source and closed source have a lot of different pros and cons. It's useful to think of this as a spectrum where there are different sort of trade-offs and different kinds of decisions. I've been working on trying to articulate what are some specific pros of open source to regulators. I'm not an open source evangelist, but I think it's useful to talk through what are some of the positive values and what are these trading off with in the closed source space. So some of the advantages or some of the positive things about open source is that it helps to pool resources. So instead of different closed institutions having to sort of reinvent the wheel over and over again, you can build off one another's expertise, build off one another's advancements, and make further innovations that way. It helps with accessibility as well as lowering barriers. So I work at HuggingFace, and when I visit universities, I'm told across the universities that students are using it heavily to learn about machine learning, that this is sort of the new way that students are engaging with machine learning, able to use data, able to use models, really dig into it. And when you add things like low code or no code solutions, it makes it even more possible for social scientists, people without technical backgrounds to really explore and understand. So it doesn't have to be this esoteric thing behind closed doors. It leads to more innovation. So the more people at play, the more you can innovate on new ideas. This is also a way of addressing some of the diversity issues in tech. So tech has issues in retention and inclusion of women, of Black people. When you have these open spaces, it's a lot easier to open it to more people who aren't barred by sort of tech institutions. It leads to things like accountability via transparency, so you can follow the source of code, follow the source of data in order to figure out who made what decisions. And that also leads to better behaviors. So if people are going to publicly know what you did and didn't do, then you are going to tend to do the right thing a lot more. It allows for things like privacy, so you can have models run on your own system, run on your own computer. You don't have to interact with a tech company sending your data their way. They keep the data, or sending your data their way, they keep the data, you don't know what happens to it. So it allows for you to have your own content, your own intellectual property, and own it yourself. A freedom of choice, right? So with a diversity of options, there's the ability to choose between different kinds of solutions that might work best for you. And then some flexibility in the kinds of things you can do. This can be trusted with things like centralization of power in closed source. So when things are closed source, it's easier for large companies to be able to work with the models, train the models, build up more power. And the intellectual effort that's put forward doesn't get well distributed. It really centralizes in these specific places, which makes the divide between sort of the haves and have-nots even greater. There's opacity around different kinds of bias and harm issues, and Relatedly, there's a lot of possibility of creating hype through misunderstanding. So one example is that there's been recent discussion about potential emergent properties from large language models, with the idea that the model is doing something that it hasn't seen in the data, and yet there isn't transparency in the data. So it's very easy for people to make that sort of advertisement about their systems when there isn't transparency about where these behaviors are actually coming from. And security issues aren't addressed as quickly, so in the open source community, there's sort of always someone awake, always something working on it. When you have a lot less people working on the systems, a lot of things can fly under the radar for a long time, and there isn't as many people at play to deal with the various issues. So those are some of the sort of pros and cons in that space. If I had more time, I would do the reverse, but I'm sort of here to represent open source a bit, so these are some of the pros and corresponding cons of closed source. I work at HuggingFace, which is a good example of open science and to some extent open source, which is, it's providing the largest collection of open source models to date. We have over 200,000 models, 34,000 data sets, involving 10K organizations and a ton of different users. So it ends up being a utility that a lot of people are finding very useful, in part because of the openness. So an example project that HuggingFace has done in the spirit of openness with a bunch of other institutions, including the Turing Institute, is the Big Science Project. And the basic idea with the Big Science Project was that we wanted to train a large language model in the open. So this is one of the brains of generative AI right now. The idea was, can we do this in a way where the public can see what's happening, understand all the various issues at play, all the different values at play. So this was supported in part by France on their Jean Zay supercomputer. And we were trying to look at the space of language model research in terms of all different kinds of things that people are doing behind closed doors in different institutions. So we were looking at issues of data governance, which I'll talk about in a bit. We were looking at multilinguality. We were looking at different methods of evaluation and sort of doing this all in the open so people could understand everything that was going on. It was eventually something like 45 languages and people providing data around the world. And we took an approach to data governance where we tried to figure out the values at play with the people at the table and build a sort of charter from that in order to drive our decisions moving forward. So establishing high-level goals as well as values. And then we ended up creating a skeleton of a governance structure based on those different kinds of values and corresponding roles. We worked on getting buy-in from different kinds of organizations and creating resources for different tasks in light of different entities' goals and needs. So this is things like interpretability, analysis, as well as hosting. I wanted to present this as a sort of TLDR for data governance, for open data governance, where the basic idea is that you have data custodians, data rights holders, data steward, data helpers, and data modelers. The data rights holders are the people who create the data. The data custodians are people who provide it further and host it. So providers can collate the data, collect it, make it available. Data hosts can then serve it on their servers. These might be the same institutions. Data host and data provider might be the same institution, or they could be different institutions. The role of data hosts is to figure out who is allowed to use the data under what conditions. So this is where the spectrum of open to closed really comes into play, where it's open if you are approved to use it, that it's sort of been decided that you won't use it for malicious use. This is done with the help of lawyers, rights advocates, and ethicists. So the idea here is that there needs to be a space where everyone can come to the table, talk about different conflicting issues, as well as things like interoperability. So this data stewardship organization is really critical to the overall data governance structure. And then the data modelers are people who are working with the data and doing things with it, so things like researchers. So this nice ecosystem sort of falls out of all the values that we worked through, and we're continuing to work on trying to set up more data hosts, more custodians, and see how far we can get with this sort of international data governance structure. The basic roles here are the custodians, modelers, helpers, and the stewardship organization, which can sort of be broken down into these very basic tasks of making the data available, people who provide the various data, the modelers who define the kind of data is needed, so they're providing the demand for the data helpers who speak up for people whose rights might be getting squashed, and then the collaborative space is the data stewardship organization. Another project in the open source space that might be interesting and worth knowing about is called the Stack. And the Stack is 6 terabytes of permissively licensed code where we tried to work on clever licenses, so trying to make sure that they're the most open licenses possible, as well as providing ways for people to opt out. So you can check, am I in the stack, and remove yourself. So we try and be as open as possible with this. And this is used to build a model called Star Coder, which is sort of like Copilot. If folks are familiar with that, it's basically a way to code alongside a machine. This is an example of what the gated use is for the stack. So in the spectrum of open to close, this is like a little bit more closed, but still in the open science space where you have to agree to the different conditions. You have to agree that if someone opts out, your data set is similarly updated so that the important information is removed, that sort of thing. Here's an example of the documentation we provide for it, where we try and give some amount of accountability to everyone involved. So the dataset curators are mentioned by name along with their contact information, going through information like the social impact. So this is something that's relevant for journalists, something that's relevant for regulators, sort of trying to think about how do we democratize this in a way that different audiences, regardless of where they're from, are able to understand what's going on. And then one of the key strategies here is a release gradient. And this is great work by my colleague Irini Papadimitriou, where the idea is that when you're trying to make a release of some sort of data set or some sort of model, you need to work through a lot of different issues to figure out how open or closed it should be. So some questions are around access, the components that allow risk analysis, and the components that enable model replication. Some of the impacts to consider are the concentration of power, whether or not a system will be exacerbating harm, malicious use and misuse, things like auditability, which require paper trails, so documentation, these kinds of things. Issues of accountability, who's being named and how far back can you trace the different decisions that are made. And normative value judgments. What do we want? Do we want equal representation of people from this model? Do we want to have a model we put out that will propagate biases? These are all the sort of value judgments you need to make when you're trying to figure out how to release something. And then the sort of fundamental philosophical question is, how do we make it good in the high-level sort of concept of abstract concept of goodness? Right. So here's how you can kind of see the release gradient from closed, no access, to fully open. Fully open is the community research, high auditability, this sort of thing. Closed is more for internal research and has low auditability, less of a diversity of perspectives and that sort of thing. And then throughout this gradient, you can go from gradual and staged release, where you slowly release models to more and more people. You get feedback on how it's working, and then update the model based on that, the staged or iterative approach, which is something that OpenAI has been doing and that Irini helped lead while she was at OpenAI. Hosted access, this is where the gating controls come in that I just mentioned, where you figure out whether or not someone should have access to something based on them filling out information about their use cases and that sort of thing. And then fully open, which comes with, obviously, some risks of misuse and malicious use. Here's just some examples to get a sense of the landscape right now. So some fully open models are Bloom from Big Science and GPT-J from Eleuther AI. Some fully closed include Palm from Google. DALL-E 2 has this hosted access with some amount of gating. GPT-3 is API-based access. So there really is a spectrum here, and where you should fall in the spectrum is a function of the values at play. Yeah, that's about it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I guess we're going to kick off our panel now. I'm so excited and honored to be here with both of you. If I were in the middle, this would be a sandwich of AI superstars, I feel. But yeah, just I think to kick things off, ooh, getting a little bit of feedback. Maybe I'll scoot over slightly. There we go. Okay, slightly better. Yay. One of the things I'm sort of interested in, Margaret, building off of your presentation, and I think this is like a big theme for our panel, maybe like generally, is thinking about the role of public participation in AI. I'm really curious in both of your minds, what could that look like? You've laid out, I think, some really great roadmaps and like frameworks that your team has used. I'm curious, what are ways we can also bring the general public in, and what could that look like, and what should that look like, and what role could the everyday public play, I guess, more in either shaping the way AI impacts their lives, or even generally being a part of a participatory model with AI? And I know that's quite a broad.
Yeah, there are a lot of things at play there. So it's sort of related to a question I get a lot, which is like, how can an everyday person or a person who's not involved in tech at all support ethical AI work? To which one of, I think, the key answers is support the free press. So one of the great counterbalances around malicious use and bad use or illegal use from companies is the press doing investigative work. And so I always get sort of frustrated when people complain that they can't read some ethics AI-oriented article because it's behind a paywall, because journalists should be supported for that work because they're one of the only like key counterbalances we have. And then I think the sort of more direct answer to your question is around sharing openly the sorts of things that are going wrong for you. So activists play a really key role in shaping how technology evolves. So it's really important for people to feel comfortable openly sharing the experiences they're having. And then part of the solution that I've been particularly interested in working on is these sort of low-code and no-code solutions, or solution sounds very corporate. Low-code and no-code approaches to working with AI. So if you just want to play around with something, all you have to do is like press some buttons, do some drop-downs, this sort of thing, in order to really understand what it's doing. You could play with your own data, put up your own images. Ideally, if it's hosted on your computer, then you can keep it quite private in order to play with different things and understand. And then if you pair that with things like open source ability to provide feedback, which is another thing that we've been working on at HuggingFace, like community notes from everyone, updates to the documentation available to everyone, then I think it's a lot more possible to bring in non-tech people to weigh in on things and flag issues and suggest new innovation, that sort of thing.
Amazing, thank you. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'm coming from the vantage point of being an accountability practices researcher. So primarily I'm interested in the kind of mechanisms and approaches that developers or deployers of AI systems might be more accountable to the people affected by them. And thinking about the kind of both the sort of social technical assessments for AI that we might, operationalize this mythical AI ethics kind of framework that that we're lucky to have a wealth of research on already. But I'm very interested in like the democratic deliberation tradition and providing routes for members of the public who might normally not have the opportunity to scrutinize or pass judgments on systems, I think is really critical. And I think particularly in the sort of AI development space, which is really predicated on sort of quite key industry players, particularly often in commercial environments, there's this question around how you like reconcile participation with innovation and unpacking some of those incentive structures, which are a little different to deliberative democracy in sort of local government or in democratic institutions. So yeah, I think we're at a really interesting juncture in that there's a lot of groundswell of excitement for participatory AI, but I think I'm trying to work through the weeds at the moment and think, what does that actually look like on the ground, and how can we embed those routes to accountability for the people most affected by AI?
Totally. And Irini, also jumping to you, I think of the arts as like a very critical part actually of creating participatory AI and also creating legible AI and transparent AI. What are your thoughts with the previous question?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for starting this, Caroline. Actually, that was exactly what I wanted to say, coming from an arts background and working with spaces like the Science Gallery in London, but also like artists and other like art collectives, but also activists as well. I think there is a very important role there in terms of questioning ideas about participation and what it means, and consent as well. And I don't want to take the conversation in a different direction, but just wanted to bring up something that comes up to my mind when I think about participation, which is a work by Cuban-born artist Tania Bruguera, who did Tatlin's Whisper 5 at Tate Modern back in 2008, and many people in the room probably remember it. And it was a participatory performance, and when visitors arrived at the Turbine Hall, encountered two mounted policemen who were directing the audience around the space, so they would move the crowd from one side to the other and clearing certain areas, but also and pathways without like having a certain goal. And this is something that brings to my mind how artists often help us question these ideas about how do we bring up participation, what we mean by kind of participation. And obviously Tania Bruguera there was questioning power relations and also terms of engagement. And when it comes to these things, it's something that we always, I guess, question as well. And artists create this, conversations and spaces where we can start thinking about these ideas and what that means, and whether participation, well, the fact that participation doesn't always mean equal power. And of course, I'm not saying that to kind of, just say that we shouldn't, create spaces like that, but it's just mainly like thinking about, questions about power and equality, and like who leads on these kind of processes as well, which is really, I guess it's coming, it's very important in the space of AI as well, and when we're talking about participatory AI.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. One of the things that comes to mind also from y'all's answers, and something I've been ruminating on, is I often think of participation linked in a way to transparency and explainability. If you're inviting the public in, sometimes you have to sort of explain and contextualize in terms of what a process is. And one of the things I'm really interested in is what are meaningful versions of that? So what is meaningful public participation? Like, what does it need versus, let's say, how it can be co-opted and misused by some for-profit companies, for example. And I think about this also a lot in like a transparency space, right? Where something can be disclosed to you, but not actually be necessarily actually transparent. So for the panelists, I'm curious, like, what are characteristics or requirements that you would like to see to enable things like public participation? And also, if you want to move away from that question, also related to like actual public transparency in a way, for engineers, but also for the general public. I really liked the point you've brought up, Margaret, about these sort of low code or no code environments. And I'm also just curious too, where at times have you seen things miss the point? Like trying to aim for transparency or this kind of public participation and not quite getting there?
Yeah, these are those are great questions. So there's a few different. Oh, sorry, I'm just like barging ahead.
Go,
Yeah.
Okay.
Fascinating question. I'm going to tell you what I think. Yeah. So one of the things at play is participatory design, which I think is already sort of being alluded to, which is where you bring in different people from different communities representing different subpopulations at the start of the project, throughout the project, in order to figure out different things. And so one approach in participatory design is that you bring in people and sort of describe at a high level the sort of project you're trying to do, get their reactions, see what they're confused about, what scares them, and then try and design in light of those sorts of things. Another approach in participatory design is to give them the details of what you're doing and have them sort of further weigh in, provide comments on that sort of thing. Ideally, you would pay for people participating, right? Yeah, I don't know that that always happens, but you know, I'm sort of the impression that if you're using people's labor and you're making profit, you should be compensating them for their labor. Another sort of part of this is around auditing and auditability. So there's a few different kinds of audits that can be done. In terms of public participation, it's called a third-party audit, where it's sort of like if you're using some API, so if you're using some system through a company's provided services, you can try different things yourself and see, does this work, does this not work, right? So the sort of classic example at this point is gender classification that works better for white men than black women. Side note, I don't think gender classification should be a task, but Joy Bulamwini has done some amazing work on showing that you can do basic auditing just working with whatever a company is making available and trying different examples, and anyone can basically do that. Funnily enough, some of the corporate response has been to remove the ability to have demos for free. So there's a little bit of a response back there, but in general, you can imagine with some regulation, these kinds of third-party audits become more accessible for people to do. And then another part of this that I'm sort of interested in is whether or not people who are actually representing or have the lived experience of different subpopulations and are working inside the tech company are included, and if there's someone else they can report to if they're not. So this goes into whistleblowing techniques, which there isn't very good whistleblowing support for problematic development of AI technologies. But you can imagine that someone who has lived experiences that are fundamentally different than the majority of people in tech companies should be able to speak up, and if they're not, they should be able to whistleblow in some way to an external party.
Totally. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I probably echo everything Margaret said, but I think, yeah, meaningful participation, it's almost like meaningful as a contested concept, right? Like meaningful to who, by who gets to decide. So it's really difficult to pick through these questions. I guess in the ideal sense, I would agree with Margaret, ideally it's this process of co-inquiry and collaboration and draws from the rich body of literature from human-computer interaction, community activism, and there's this sort of ongoing, or this conduit to kind of ongoing decision-making power. So there's that accountability mechanism there again. That's what that's the ideal, but in practice, obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that. So I think what I always say to people interested in applying these approaches is like, what is the question that participation can help you answer?
Right.
And that will help guide you in the kind of terms of like the mode or the specific approach that you might want to use. But yeah, I think it speaks to the challenge of like participatory AI being so capacious, is then there's obviously this risk that there's a risk of co-optation where kind of shallower approaches that aren't compensated, and there's this kind of like perhaps sort of large-scale participation, but it's sort of weaker and it's not buttressed, and there's not less of a respect for deep knowledge and lived experience and all those pieces. That's kind of where we fall into dangerous territory. But yeah, and it's an interesting counterfactual of like, is some form of participation always better than nothing? And I'd be keen for thoughts from anyone in this room about that. Yeah, I don't know.
No worries.
Yeah.
If it's also easier with any of these questions, I know for me, it's sometimes easier to be like, in this case study, this is the context of which I would do this.
Yeah.
Fair.
That makes sense.
Irini, would you like to also add?
Yeah, actually, without repeating, everything what everybody else said, I guess one thing that I've been thinking more about this, the idea of like creating with rather than about or for other people. And so yes, just having that, I guess, social impact. And of course, like, as we have shared before, it's just thinking about where participation happens as well, and participatory design as well. So, for example, is it if we are, how about consumer products? Like, can they have public participation built into them, or not? Or are we talking about different values in different spaces of participation? So this question as well, if we are thinking about commercial use rather than non-profit as well. And one thing that I kind of think about all the time is that the reality is that obviously when we talk about companies or corporations and that develop like technologies and AI systems, etc., are in a way like they are looking for growth and revenue at the end. So, which is very much what happens in our capitalist society. So in that case, what do we mean by if we have like participatory design or participation, and how, as Margaret said, about labor as well, and paying people. So that's something that I also think it's really interesting to think about.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and just a note for everyone, especially those online as well, that we will be taking questions from the public. So if you have a question, do not worry, because we will be asking you for them. I will be asking you for them. So I hope that you come up with some questions. But that will be, we're going to ask a few more. But yeah, start formulating what you would like to ask our panelist. Thank you so much for that, by the way, everyone. One of the things I'm also sort of curious about, sort of knowing the barriers and also the care it takes to really engender and create a space in which you can have participatory AI, or just general working across with many different practitioners. One of the things I'm curious about is when and or if should we have things like public participation with AI models? Like, what is the context of which you think that works best? And then maybe as a curveball, is that what we should be aiming for, or are there other models or ways of working that you feel perhaps could be a better angle? And I know this is quite large, so I will say, like, please feel free to use an example or a case study that comes to mind. I'm very pro participatory AI, but I also recognize in certain contexts, like if I come at this from the online harassment perspective, there's a lot of things you cannot and should not share with the public. And so we can redefine participation to like very specific case stakeholders and case studies, and sort of end up doing micro versions of projects many, many times. That's how I tend to approach this.
Completely, yeah.
But I'm curious about y'all as well. So like what are aspects of AI building that are appropriate for public participation? Or in what context? Like, what is the ideal use case perhaps for you?
It's a great question. I think it's very difficult to settle on an ideal use case.
Or a use case.
A use case. I think what I've been thinking about a lot at the moment is, certainly through my research, is how you get members of the public to deliberate on, say, impacts of a model like GPT-4, or like a foundational or a general purpose model with inordinate downstream impacts or uses. And I think the answer is I have no idea, but I think it's an interesting question to, how do these approaches scale? If we're thinking about care and carefulness and, careful disruption, I guess, how do you scale that to the sense that, that it can, that kind of lens can inform sort of ongoing model development in a way that, it's kind of, it reverberates around it, like, so that the effects are realized globally. And I think it's a really interesting challenge. So I've not really answered your question because it's not a specific case study, but it's just something I've been ruminating on, and I'd be keen for Margaret's thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think in general, and I'm hesitating because I haven't thought this through entirely. I think in general, it makes sense for complete openness around things that go wrong within the intended use of a model. So if it's intended to work well across different subpopulations, then we should have openness when it doesn't. On the other hand, malicious use is something that if you further propagate that malicious use, then you can create a worse problem. And so now I don't want to give an example.
I mean, a great one is always Taybot, you know, from.
Oh yeah,
years ago.
I can throw Microsoft under the bus, sure. So Taybot Tay was a system that was deployed on social media that was. I worked internally, so I'm actually not 100% sure what's NDA and what's not. So I'm going to try and be very general here.
I can also describe it if it's helpful.
You go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Taybot, from my experience when it launched as an online harassment researcher at the time, was a Twitter bot in which you could have a conversation on Twitter, which is where it was deployed as a bot, and you could ask it different things, and it would sort of have, at the time, what felt like much higher fidelity conversations than was possible, or at least from what we had seen in other kinds of chatbot, consumer-facing chatbot products, for example. And it was also, I think, originally designed in a way to sort of mimic the conversational style of a teenage girl. Very quickly, the internet, particularly Reddit and 4chan, because it spread throughout particular boards there, sort of, I guess, retrained it to be a neo-Nazi. And then what I saw also was it actually became this it became this tool of harassment that had been unforeseen, because you could, if I had blocked, Margaret, if you'd blocked me, I could say, Taybot, tell @Margaret Mitchell that I don't like her. And since Taybot was this neutral chatbot that Margaret maybe hadn't blocked, I could supersede my blocking.
Right.
To harass people, which is what Gamergate used when it was launched.
Right. Yeah, so you're getting at the exploit effect, right? So Taybot had a few exploits, and that was something that I suppose was problematic to be more open about, as you discover, because it was specifically for malicious use, right? So one exploit was as you say. Another one was you could say something like "repeat after me."
Yes.
There was a certain that's why I'm I don't know which of this is under NDA and not.
That's what we saw in Gamergate. Was they would say "repeat after me," and then they would tag high-profile victims like Zoe Quinn, and so all these people that these high-profile victims of Gamergate had blocked using different mass blocking tools, they were able to get around it.
Right. So that's a case where transparency back towards the company to let them know this is an issue that's happening makes a lot of sense. Transparency to the general public will largely open up malicious use and misuse, and so it's a bit of a function of how much of a benefit versus a harm will being transparent about this information cause, and doing that sort of pro and con trade-off there. And yeah, I guess that's a pretty good example for that. And yeah, this is also a situation where it does make sense to have more closed-door conversations with specific parties. Mm-hmm. So there are things that I talk about with people more involved in policy and regulation very, very openly, you have to fix this is a big deal, that I don't share on social media, right? So there's parties that you should be open to with respect to the trade-offs in sort of the foreseeable harms and the foreseeable benefits.
I definitely agree with that. Working in online harassment research, that is very much a thing that is a normal part of our workflow. And that some of what you were talking about, this sort of the way to sort of analyze different vectors of harm, in the privacy security world, we call that threat modeling. Mm-hmm. And so one of my threat models is what would 4chan do, or what would Reddit do, or what would Kiwi Farms do.
Great model,
with my project, or what could possibly go wrong, and I map them from the smallest funny things to the largest things. I was wondering, are there also questions that y'all ask yourselves? Also, Irini, since you deal so much with the public, what are your own threat modeling questions, particularly when engaging with different AI projects, be them public, semi-public, or very private?
I guess it's also it's also asking questions in terms of how much we can, when we come together, how much we can rethink or reframe things in a way, or how much the environment or the tools that we use or the approaches that we use are fixed, and how much they are controlled in a way, and thinking about the idea, like thinking about the open source models, but also like ideas around hacking and adapting and changing things. How much of this can we do in these spaces? So rather than just following like a specific path in a way. And the other thing is also wondering, like, do we talk often about failure in these kind of processes? And I know, already Margaret and Lara talked about transparency as well. But thinking about, when things go wrong, and how much do we talk about that, not only in the public, but also in small groups, as Margaret was saying as well.
Totally, I'd love to.
I agree with Irini. I guess I'm less in the weeds with this than perhaps you both are. But I think when we're thinking about transparency as well, it's to your point, Irini, around what are the redress procedures and how do we establish those liability chains across kind of AI supply chains. And there's really interesting work coming through from recent paper from Jennifer Cobb, Jat-Singh, who I can see in the audience, so I'm looking at him. And Michael Veal, and also the Ada Lovelace Institute, released an explainer around AI supply chains and how we might, in the context of open source, what are the levers in terms of thinking through risk assessment and establishing those liability links. So I think that's a really, pressing question for the current moment.
This is definitely a situation where it helps to be a pessimist, right? So when you're dealing with a lot of like techno-solutionist optimists, then you sort of need someone at the table being like, this is terrible. My direct report, Nima, my former direct report, Nima, is here. Very good at identifying issues very quickly, right? So red teaming exercises is something that Nima really put forward at HuggingFace. So you try and figure out what are the worst case scenarios. And some people are quite good at this, And this goes to like the diversity and inclusion issue, because it turns out that the people who are sort of most well-informed, or some of the most well-informed people on societal harms, are people who have been subject to those societal harms. And so I think for me, this is part of why diversity and inclusion goes hand in hand with all the other AI development, because you need these lived experiences in order to have people like see these blind spots and flag, this is going to be an issue, this is going to be an issue. The inclusion part is a big part of it.
Totally, thank you. And going back to Laura, there was like something you just said in your answer that I would love to know more about. So you're talking about like risk assessments in a recent paper that's coming out. Would you mind getting a little more granular about that? I'm very curious in terms of how, I think about, so I work a lot with policymakers, and one of the things I like to sort of do is have a list of requirements of things that we would like to see in consumer-facing products, for example, that can help facilitate user safety or user agency. So this question I'm framing a little bit around what are like requirements or like specificities in certain domains or stacks that you are analyzing. This also extends to you as well, Margaret. That you think are needed either in terms of assessment or also in terms of public transparency or internal transparency or transparency towards, let's say, regulators. What are certain metrics, requirements, disclosures, frameworks you would like to see utilized? Also, Irini, you as well. I would love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, so I again come at this from a very socio-technical angle. So I really laud all the amazing work that Margaret and others have spearheaded around model cards and data sets and data sheets for data sets, around documentation practices, mapping kind of data provenance and model architecture, and that's really brilliant, and I think that's an integral part of a risk assessment. But I'm also interested in the more kind of, I suppose, the harder to pin down in a risk assessment, but the kind of the structural questions and the kind of, if we're moving away, I kind of shudder a little bit at the sort of the word of risk assessment. I'm wedded to it as terminology that we use because that's where we are. But I think risk is quite narrowing, and actually we really want to be thinking about, that's why I prefer the term impact assessment, because I think risk puts you into a bit of a yes, no, high, low risk binary, where actually sometimes we want to be, asking the bigger questions around, what are the socio-environmental conditions for this system to work as intended and both not intended, who are the affected stakeholders, who's the team working on this, what are the environmental impacts, what are the labor impacts, all those kind of questions, which obviously is a much bigger beast and very difficult to implement in practice. But yeah, I guess seeing both that kind of two-order effect of components to a risk assessment, I think is important, yeah.
I guess also if we could wave a magic wand, how would you like that implemented? Like if you could request.
Unlimited time, unlimited budget, unlimited amounts of people involved. Yeah, I don't know. I think what I think is really, I just really want to see is this kind of, we're still missing this question about what good looks like in a lot of these areas. And I think if we were able to wave a magic wand and have some magic agreement about what are the standards for a good risk or impact assessment or other evaluation that we should be measuring against. And again, I'm under no illusions about that as a task, but yeah, I think that's the thing that plagues me a lot at the moment.
Yeah, so I like to think of it as making a paper trail. So you can sort of break down the machine learning life cycle and development into a bunch of different components, from initial ideation to training, to evaluation, to deployment, and there's lots of pieces in there. But you can imagine that within each sort of module, you're producing an artifact, and that artifact documents the decisions that were made, the various values at play. So to the extent that you can get value-based thinking into general development, which is a challenge, but people are a little bit more open to it as of this year. Documenting all those sorts of things. What were our priorities? What were the trade-offs? Where were the error cases? And that kind of thing. And then that can be used for things like risk assessment as well as auditing. So if paper trails are sort of notoriously what's used in auditing, it can also be used to inform launch decisions. So now you can see all of the things that went into play. It's easier to spot gaps that way. That means that it's really useful for the various artifacts, the various documentation, to have protocols that will then stimulate people to think about things they wouldn't otherwise think about. So sort of questions, structured things that they need to respond to that might otherwise fly under the radar, that they won't notice. And then I also think it's really critical to do due diligence on the previous work, harms and risks. What do we know in terms of where we are now, everything that came before, other fields with parallels, doing essentially a literature review, a due diligence literature review, and using all of that information to put together a sort of summary of what we can expect going forward and what we can learn from.
Thank you. Irini?
I'll go back to the role of art and artists a little bit there in thinking about, for example, like the bridging different communities and different people, and the importance of lived experiences there in terms of understanding what is the impact of this product or anything that it goes out to the public. And in a way, I think this is where sometimes arts organizations and artists are super valuable. And I of course, I don't want to brag about the work, of course, at the Science Gallery London, but actually it is the work, especially the collaborations that happen there have been super valuable in terms of understanding how these relationships and how these different sectors and worlds and communities can come together and maybe help each other see things differently. And it's about different perspectives as well. So this is something that we've always done also at FutureEverything. And it's been amazing to have this kind of thing reflected in the project at the Science Gallery as well, in how, we can sometimes have unexpected outcomes when we bring together activists or artists or communities together with people who are sometimes the only decision makers in these processes.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Irini. I obviously very much agree, as so much of my artwork is about interrogating AI, but the critic and curator Noor Khan often describes art as this necessary Trojan horse to discuss useful, necessary change. And so like art can become a conduit to have, I think at times, conversations we kind of cannot have in other spaces. And I really appreciate that point because a lot of different folks have talked about art as like this form of R&D and how that actually can really help impact AI. It's now time, I think, to start switching into the Q&A. If people have questions, if they don't, I definitely have some more, so no pressure. Oh yeah, we have lots of questions, great. Okay, we're gonna start over here and then go like you, and then back to you. How's that sound? So would you like to go first? Oh yeah, right there, yeah.
Sorry, that must be the code. Great conversation, thank you so much. Say I'm an AI scientist, just for you to understand where I come from. Say I build prototypical AI systems. So the question is about participation and different public perceptions of the benefits of AI around the world. So there's been a survey in 2022 done by Ipsos. I think it had like 25,000 people all over the world. And people have been asked about the benefits of AI and the impact of AI for their life. And one of the, for me, more surprising findings was that in emerging economies, AI seems to be seen as something very positive. So the approval scores were in their high 60s and 70s, whereas in countries like the UK, Canada, US, France, it was in their 30s perhaps. Do you have any thoughts why this might be, and how do these results impact how we design AI systems?
Great question. Yeah. Who would want to go first?
Yeah, this is new information to me, so I feel like 60s and 70s still isn't high. But it's definitely higher than 30%. So one of the things this is reminding me of is that people in San Francisco were some of the most vocal about banning facial recognition, and people in San Francisco were the people working on facial recognition. So there might be an aspect there where when you're part of the system and building these things, you realize just how badly things can go. I've heard some other stories about how like AI researchers don't tend to have smart devices in their homes, right? Like exactly this sort of thing, right? So it's like, you know, I maybe use a printer and I have a hammer in case it makes any funny sound, right? So that might be part of it. Sort of people in the population are more involved in the development, and so they have more of a sense that maybe that's part of it. But yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
See that being the case in New Orleans where facial recognition was banned and then the ban was rolled back. Different city council members were like, well, one day it's going to work really well, right?
Right.
And it's like, no, sweetie, no, it's not. I say that I'm from New Orleans, and so I was following this very closely. I believe we had another question right there.
Thanks so much for the wonderful discussion. My question for the panel would be, so how can researchers and policymakers design participatory approaches to foster inclusive definitions of the public? One of the main critiques in the literature is, situations where the public is defined reductively. And a classic example would be, the First Nations in the US, communities that were historically excluded from the definitions of the public that sometimes are promoted. So how can we avoid that? Thank you.
Happy to have a stab.
Go for it.
I think you've tapped into a really, perennial challenge. I think particularly for kind of national level policy making, it's the idea of, that's our remit and we have to speak to the kind of, the national base. And I think so much nuance gets lost in that. But I think there are some really good lessons to be learned from local government and other kind of much more local targetized experimentations with these work, that we're not starting from a totally blind position. But I think just making a kind of simple conceptual shift from around that, there is multiple publics, so that we don't, and I find myself doing it all the time. I'm like, oh, really, I'd say, public participation, but maybe it should be public's participation, which is a bit clunky, but I just came up with that one on the fly.
I like that.
Can have that one for free. It's a really interesting challenge. I'd be really keen for Irini's take on this one, I think, from her work with artists and communities. It's not to throw it you on the
Yeah,
spot.
go for it. No. Yeah, Irini, you want to add in? Jump in?
I don't know if I have an answer for that, just saying that though the work that many community groups and activists and artists have been doing is really important in terms of highlighting the issues there and the need for that. I'm just thinking of one example, like the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, the community group, which was about the abolishing facial recognition in the police state, and they have done so much amazing work and writings and published reports and resources. So this has been a really interesting example in terms of highlighting the need for that. And I guess it's an ongoing question, as Lara was saying, and of course it's something that I guess we need to think about in terms of who participates in that as well, and how does it happen in a way that, again, it doesn't become directed from a specific group of people. And so
Do you have any thoughts to add?
So I think this is where social scientists really play a key role, and sociologists. So I think of it in terms of different sort of sensitive characteristics and different population subgroups. So you mentioned publics, and that reminds me a lot of my thinking around subpopulations. And this also matters to things like bias, all these different sort of things, where when you have people who are aware of groups that are historically subject to discrimination and that kind of thing, these can be listed out, right? And so the US has protected groups. The UK, I think the wording is sensitive groups, also maybe protected groups. China has some that aren't shared. So China also has immigration status and vaccination status, which isn't protected in the US or the UK, as far as I know. But this is where it's important to have people who actually understand these different identity characteristics that are historically subject to discrimination, and making sure that each of them are accounted for very intentionally.
For sure. Thank you so much for that. I know in a lot of the work I do, which a lot of it is user research based, one of the things we'll do is also isolate, or rather map out and look at different groups, and then purposely either solicit or bring in stakeholders from those communities to ensure that their voices are heard, but also actually counted for in the different research we're doing, be it surveys or interviews, for example, which is things other companies could do and spend time on. All right, I'm going to go to one of our questions online, then we're going to jump back into our live audience questions, our physical audience questions. People are live online as well. So sorry about that. Servia wrote, "Wonderful discussion, thank you. AI systems are quite extractive in the data and training they rely on. Do we see ideas of participation, transparency, and accountability speak to the problem of extraction? If so, how? And are there other ideas you would like to add to the mix to address the extraction at play?" I know, it's a really good one.
It's a really good one.
Yeah.
Kind of want to ruminate on that one for a sec if anyone has a knee-jerk thought.
Yeah, I mean, so with transparency, you can know who the data is being extracted from, or with certain kinds of transparency. And so, right, so I mean, as is maybe known here, data collection is done largely without informed consent. So people have written blogs online, this kind of thing. They never intended for it to be sucked up, vacuumed up by machine learning models. Even if they do have licenses on them, they're licenses that are from an earlier time that weren't developed in light of the machine learning uses. And so even if there's like...
The Creative Commons license?
I'm thinking of Creative Commons in particular. Yes, exactly. So I think that there are specific sort of axes of transparency or dimensions of transparency that are specifically related to extractive practices. So that goes around what domains are being sampled, what licenses are being used, the locations where the data is collected. So are we collecting from people we're not compensating, for example, in Nairobi, or getting annotations from there, paying them much less than we're paying people in the US? There's a whole economic discussion there. But to sort of summarize what I just said, if you're interested in extraction, there are specific axes of transparency that will inform on what the extractive practices are. And so those are the kinds of things that you want to document as part of the overall paper trail in development.
Yeah, very much bringing that back to auditability. I know a definition that I use for meaningful transparency is legibility. So is it legible across all different groups to understand? Auditability, can all of those groups effectively audit it? And then space for impact or interaction. So once you've audited it, you can put that audit somewhere or share a complaint, and there is like a timely and well understood process of when you'll be responded to and how.
Yeah, I was going to say similarly, like I think processes like audit can help facilitate that idea of like, okay, we've got a lens to what's being extracted and where, and having that as a kind of artifact, and thinking about the other institutional mechanisms that can kind of signify the problem and say, okay, we've seen this extraction, like what are the next steps, what are the routes to contestability and redress, and there's this interesting piece around kind of like meaningful consent and informed consent that we were talking about before, with the like opt-in process, which I now have totally mind-blanked out the name of it, but for opting out of having your data scraped with training data sets?
Opting in
out. Yeah, things like that. Maybe provide also some routes to kind of mitigating extraction in that context.
Yeah, Irini, any thoughts to add as well?
I'm more, I guess, familiar with within the art space and the work that is happening to create transparency there, but also make people aware in terms of like where data is coming from. And so I'm thinking like one example of the work of artist Holly Herndon, who's with Spawning, but also Have I Been Trained, which is kind of helping in particular artists and people to kind of understand where kind of images in whether their work or images have been used in training data sets, and ways for them to opt out. So yeah, I guess that's one example of like amazing work that is happening in this context.
I think Adam Harvey also has a similar project as well. This reminds me a little bit, and then we'll go back to the questions in the audience, of I think it was a recent congressional hearing in the US where I think it's someone, not from maybe it's from the WGA, but from a particular union in Hollywood, sort of asking or talking about consent, credit, and compensation for use of artistic.
That's what I say.
That's what, yeah.
I've been pitching that to regulators. Someone else said it?
Yeah,
the 3 C's.
A man said this.
The 3 C's.
So we know where it came from.
Well, maybe it was independently thought of, but I've been, it's penetrating. It's penetrating.
Yeah, so there was a recent, I believe a congressional hearing somewhat tied to, I want to say the strikes, but it was also about effectively generative AI, and how definitely there's copyrighted works within there, right? And so talking about how artists and creators deserve consent, credit, and compensation.
That's cool. When you can tie your ideas to little slogans and little catchy things, it seeps in a lot better. It's kind of a trick when you're trying to, affect things.
Totally.
Speaking of public participation, that's another thing. Can you think of like little clever ways of putting things and then it sticks? Yeah, that's really cool.
But yeah, so that's something I think about a lot with extraction, knowing that I'm an artist who also works a lot with photography, and most likely my copyrighted images are probably in a lot of large data sets without my consent at all. What a fun thing. Yay for me. Moving on to the next question. Yes, in the striped shirt.
Hi everyone, thanks so much. Super interesting. Also, my mind's going at like 3,000 miles an hour because there's all these ideas flying about. But I'm I have been one of the policymakers you speak of, now a regulator that you also speak of. And I suppose, and I've been in sort of participatory like citizens' juries and different things, specifically in relation to health data. And it's been, I would say, like pretty transformative in the way that I have thought about things, of like bringing, I think specifically in health, we always expect people to come to us rather than us to go to them if we want them to be involved, right? So that's like a key tenet of like what I see. And I think one of the more interesting things I've seen recently in terms of participation was the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI, which if you look at the methodology on it, global, huge, like very effective, I would say, in terms of like participatory engagement, specifically in relation to AI. However, coming from a policy background, regulatory background, it's quite hard to see how, even if we have all of, Lara, to your point, even if we have all the money, all the resources, all the time, and people are, you know, say there's like a publics panel, whatever, within a profit-making company, say a Meta, you know, Alphabet, whatever. Even if they're doing all those things, it's very difficult to be optimistic that they will listen and that they will make any changes. And it's not to say that all of us who are in sort of this space thinking about this and wanting to do better aren't going to, but I suppose, how do you feel, maybe is it only regulation that can do that? Regulation in this area hasn't always been known to be that effective. So there's like a little bit of like, how do you think practically this could actually, you know, work and be done, and actually we could get that buy-in across the board? And I suppose as sort of like a side point to that, and I know particularly, Margaret, you've been through some interesting things with some of the more corporate organisations, and I suppose to that point, how do you stay optimistic with all of this as well?
Love that. Love it. A very multi-layered, important question. I'm also just curious now, like which regulator you work with, but I will not have you say that publicly.
I'm happy to have that, and then I'll pass it over to you. Yeah, I think your point around, you know, how do we regulate or enact these processes in policy is a good one, because it's very challenging to do well, and has often kind of been ineffectual. So I think in absence of policy levers, we have to think about kind of both like what incentives can be negotiated internally within tech companies and also externally. So maybe externally, there's a big role for civil society, I see, in terms of setting standards. And I know Partnership on AI have done a lot of work, really good work in this space around that. Obviously, the work of activists, journalists, in helping to set the standards, but also, I mean, there's really passionate advocates for this work within tech companies, but they are very stymied to bring atomize. And again, I'll hand over to Margaret to speak to this more cogently. But I think we just have to be really clever and tactical about what can be leveraged, and maybe that's a case of, you know, like we have to meet, you know, companies where they are, but then I also worry about the risk of co-optation, and like if we let tech companies entirely mark their own homework with these things, it's you know, that's capture, right? So it's a question that I'm working through a lot of my research at the moment, and I'm very happy to speak further after this as well. We can go through the weeds, but yeah, pass these two.
Yeah, I see it identically. Yeah. So I like to think of the larger ecosystem where regulators can only do so much, tech companies can only do so much, activists can only do so much, the free press can only do so much, general public or people who aren't involved in tech can only do so much, but they're all part of this larger system. And so I think, at least on the sort of regulatory side, one of the goals might be to make sure that all those other pieces, their voices are heard, right? So enabling and empowering all the parts of the system to come in and influence things. And so I brought up whistleblowing previously, right? So you might not be able to enforce very strict self-regulation or very strict regulation on a tech company, but you could make it possible for people who blow the whistle on problematic practices to be protected, right? So I like to think of it in terms of this large ecosystem. We're all players here. There's push and pull. We all sort of have a role. And so what can we do to sort of enable and empower one another to be the most informed, make the best progress, sort of working together? Yeah.
To actually sort of turn to Irini, but also sort of plug the event we're in. This is where I actually think cultural institutions have such an important role to play in not only informing the public about these ideas, but helping bring them in and also provide an imaginary of what the future could be and should be. Irini, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Exactly what you're saying, Caroline, and I just wanted to bring up two examples here that were of projects and collaborations, in this case, that were made possible with the Science Gallery communities. So in the gallery, you will see two projects that have been part of the exhibition, Does AI Care and Artificial Intelligence? And this is, I think these are like two really interesting examples of researchers, people from the healthcare and field, and also community groups like young people and young adults with heart conditions, and also receiving cancer treatment as well, when they have the opportunity to come together and like talk about these issues in terms of technology, AI, and the future of healthcare in this case. And it's really, I think it's really exciting to see work like that and opportunities like that happening in terms of facilitating these and these exchanges, these knowledge exchanges as well, because it's about like thinking about how often, you know, people from outside research and also healthcare, science, etc., like have can reach these, can come together. So I think this is a really valuable, that's a very valuable kind of thing to kind of keep in mind in terms of, understanding like the impact and also how do we make change in this case.
Great, thank you. I think we have a few more questions in the audience. Yeah, so.
Should I go?
Yeah,
okay.
Go for it.
Thank you so much. First of all, this has been a really rich and interesting discussion. I guess my question is somewhat going past the participation part, but one of the things that I picked out in your slides, Margaret, was that you were talking about value pluralism. And I can see how participation can be part of the journey towards value pluralism, but I'm just interested in reflections or maybe pointers to approaches or interesting work that you've seen that succeeds in doing this in AI systems, when I feel like a lot of computational systems, their goal is partly to centralize a very particular perspective on something. And so I guess I'm just curious what approaches the panel has seen to trying to embed that value pluralism in the systems that we use.
So, I mean, I mentioned the Big Science project, and one of the things I don't think I directly said, but I think you were picking up, is that was a value pluralism approach, where the idea was, can we build this technology where we all have different competing values, and then we sort things out via mechanisms of consensus? And there's an important distinction between a unanimous decision and a consensus decision. But I think Big Science is and the Bloom model is a relatively good example of that and how that's turned out okay. And then there was recently a study done through Stanford that showed that of all the sort of language models at play right now, the Bloom model that came out of that most closely aligned with the EU AI Act, even though it was created before the EU AI Act. So that's some evidence. I haven't read that paper, so I maybe disagree with the rubric or whatever, but at least there is some evidence from smart people that this value pluralism approach within Big Science did have some good effects. Other than that, I don't really know of success. I mean, I think value pluralism is a new idea to people in tech. You know, it was certainly new to me a year and a half ago. I don't think it was really part of my lexicon until then. So. I just think that people really haven't been considering approaches around that much. So probably there aren't a lot of good examples of it.
Yeah, I would certainly struggle as well. So yeah, that's on the agenda, at least.
Right, yeah. But it's really important to know that this exists, and this idea, like this Confucian idea of harmonizing values and all these sorts of things are, I think, really critical to become more knowledge about as we move forward with things like trying to align AI, right? Like align AI to whose values, right? And so this is, yeah, it's really important to know about this.
Totally. Any thoughts as well, Irini?
I get just, sorry for another time, just going back to like art examples and the cultural context. I guess this is, yeah, this is something that I think we have been talking quite a bit in terms of the like cultural context in terms of like, yeah, thinking about ethics, but also like values in different contexts and like for different groups of people that do not always kind of align, and how, yeah, and just trying to create a dialogue. So I'm not sure if that's kind of is something is relevant, but yeah, I guess from that perspective, it's something that maybe examples like within like cultural yeah, activities maybe might be able to kind of inform what is happening there for other sectors.
Totally, yeah, thank you. I know we had some more questions in the audience, but I've lost the place of who. I think yes, over in the middle. Okay, great. Can we get that person a microphone? And also, are there other questions in the audience or online? Oh,
Sorry.
we're out. Looks like we're almost out of time. Let's just do one last question. Sorry, my fault.
So thanks, really great talk. I work in healthcare, specifically in medical imaging, and we've got a lot of various kind of AI tools and models kind of coming down the track literally in the next sort of few months. And obviously, overall, the idea is that they're going to have a beneficial effect overall in terms of the patient population. But individually, I'm fully expecting them to get something wrong, and for it to go wrong, and there to be consequences for an individual patient. In terms of accountability, how do we approach that conversation, both with the providers of these kinds of tools, and then also maybe on a slightly more human level with individual patients? Because it's all very well to go in and say, oh, we've got this great tool, and for most people it's really great, but for you, it's gone wrong, and these are the consequences. Like, how do you actually approach those conversations? Big question, maybe.
Yeah,
very deep.
I think I have too many opinions on that to answer it briefly. I mean, so one, I think explainability and interpretability really play a key role. So in medical domains, and I've worked a bit in work on neurodevelopmental disorders and sort of psychological domains, where it's very clear that clinicians need to have a sense of why decisions were made the way they were made. And then the sort of black box narrative that companies are putting forward are really not helpful for that, because that comes up against automation bias, which is the tendency for people to believe the output of a system, and even in the face of contradicting evidence. So this is an area where I actually think it's largely inappropriate to be using generative models if you don't have sufficient explainability and interpretability mechanisms for clinicians, doctors to trace back how things were decided. I also think similarly that there has been a push to use AI where more rule-based or more traditional kinds of programming makes sense. So for example, I worked on a project providing summaries for parents whose kids were in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, and you want to get the explanation of what is happening with their babies absolutely precise, right? It's life or death. So you're taking all these readings of like heart rate and oxygen and all these sorts of things. You want to give the parents updates based on those readings automatically. You don't want to use a generative AI system to do that. You want to have this signal means this. It's a simple rule, and we have a template, and that template goes to the parent in that way. You want to have full control over the source of the information and then what the output is. So I feel like AI systems might be being unrolled a little too quickly in some of these domains, in part because of the hype. And so Yeah, I don't know that there's a better way of, or I don't know that there's a way to make the current system better. I think this current system of rolling out these technologies is wrong, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd absolutely echo everything Margaret's just said. I think, yeah, explainability and the automation bias thing are the real challenges. I would direct you to some work by researchers at Duke University. Mark Sendak, I'm happy to send you the paper. If helpful, did a really good co-design study with clinicians, kind of using almost like a model card type approach, where it was like, okay, what are the decisions? How do we contest them? What? And it was a real, like, kind of throughout the life cycle of the system. And it's a model like that, I think, I mean, maybe you'd, I would think if Mark would agree that it, yeah, feels like a really successful approach for the healthcare context.
Any other thoughts from the rest of our panel? Irini, would you like to add anything?
Just the only thing to add here just is again lived experiences and thinking about how how patients are affected and what is the questions around empathy as well when we think about when these systems are being unrolled in like healthcare environments, what that means for people who are on the other side and like receiving like treatment, and of course they are and how they feel and what are the gaps there, I guess.
Thank you so much for that. As someone who worked at a big tech company on AI when they rolled out a healthcare AI subsidiary, I would say please don't.
Yeah.
Please don't.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Hard pass.
Absolutely not. It's a big no for me. Thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you, the participants, for coming, but also these lovely people. I believe we're at time, right? So if you all wouldn't mind, we can go to the atrium or the above ground floor. You can go look at stuff. You have some nice cards on your chairs. Please write something and put it up. We would love to know your thoughts, your provocations, your concerns. But let's give our panelists a big round of applause.
Massive thank you from me and the organisers of London Data Week for coming, being part of the very first event. Thank you to the audience so much for coming. I think we have a QR code coming on screen any moment now, which, don't worry, it's a... here we go. It's the feedback form, so we'd be very grateful. It's going to the Science Gallery, and as I understand it, if you complete it, you'll be entered into the draw for a free meal for 2. So a very amazing incentive. I work here all the time. The food's fantastic. But yeah, please do mingle, stay for a while, have a chat, and thank you again so much for everyone for coming this evening. So.